Now, as a prosecutor, as a judge, as an attorney in private practice, and now as our nation's Attorney General, I have seen the criminal justice system firsthand and from nearly every angle. And while I have the utmost faith in and dedication to America's legal system, we must face the reality that, as it stands, our system is in too many ways broken. The course that we are on is far from sustainable.
I got a Savior.
When I hear the words mass incarceration, what comes to my mind immediately are images of slavery. You know, thoughts of systems that have been put in place to effectively disenfranchise or to cut off the political process or access to the political process of certain demographics of people.
We are the world's leader in incarceration. Since the 1970s, we've had a 500% increase in the number of people incarcerated. And we can actually combine all the Western European countries together, and we still have more people than all of Western Europe combined. So we are by far the world's leader. The people or the communities that have high rates of incarceration are urban communities, particularly urban communities of color. So it's not that incarceration throughout the United States is equal in each city, right? But it's within very small, socially disorganized urban communities. So incarceration impacts some communities much more than others.
Incarceration and how it impacts the communities. One word: devastating. It's absolutely devastating.
I believe that mass incarceration has a devastating impact on African American communities because there's no other system in place that has decimated the African American community more than mass incarceration.
It's a huge disparity. And there's 6 times, African American men are 6 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men. And this operates as well with African American women, who have a much higher rate of incarceration than Hispanic women and, by far, white women.
Troubles our community is the way that the criminal justice system laws are like crack cocaine is worse than potted cocaine. And so our men, black men, are incarcerated for longer terms than others because of nonviolent drug use or possession, and where others are sent to the hospital, we're sent to jail. As you know, we are more likely to be arrested and incarcerated, get 10 times longer jail sentences, and for nonviolent crimes. And our young boys are more likely to be sentenced as adults than other people, and which is horrendous. And the that brings about an anger.
One of the eye-opening things in Overtown was that when you have numbers like this, 2 out of 3 adult men reporting having been in jail or prison at some point in his life, that we've got an experience that rises to the level of collective. So it's collective experience now. So any kinds of programs that you do, any kind of interventions or revitalization, they are reentry programs. If you're doing a jobs program, it's a reentry program. If you're doing a health program, that's going to be a reentry program. Whatever you're doing with numbers like this.
The consequences on particularly black men, but communities of color, has been absolutely terrible. It's really broken communities and families up more than any other group.
certainly black Miami came into being around 1896, year of the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that Miami's created. And thus, Colored Town, where black folks had to live since they were segregated, could not live in quote-unquote Miami proper, although they helped to build Miami proper. From day one, it has been a struggle for equal opportunities.
Miami becomes a city in 1896. There was really nobody living here until then. Small number. When the railroad enters Miami on April 13th, and because of segregation laws, both local that were passed, but in particular state laws, we have with this brand new city a segregated black neighborhood called Colored Town, which is a common name for black segregated neighborhoods in the American South at that time. And it was on the west side, the other side, the proverbial other side of the railroad tracks, all the way down to 7th Avenue Northwest, which was the original western border. It came as far south as Northwest 6th Street, which was the southern border of the community, of the black community. And then the northern border of the brand new city was Northwest 11th Street, so it came up north as far as 11th Street. And so that was Colored Town. That eventually over time evolves into Overtown. And within a matter of a few years, there is a viable community there. And it just becomes larger and becomes more developed institutionally and otherwise in the subsequent years. So early on, it catches on as a black community.
Liberty City, when it started by Franklin Delano Roosevelt under a program called WPA. And I was living at that particular time and lived in Miami since I was a baby back in 1930. So I grew up in Overtown. And Liberty City, when it got started in 38, was a wonderful place to live. When they built this project here, this government housing, they named it Liberty City because it had electric lights, it had running water, and indoor toilets. We didn't have that in Overtown most of the time. Most people had outdoor toilets, and if it was not outdoors, it was on the back porch, and kerosene lamps. And they're fortunate they had electric lights. So when you came out here, you came to splendor, you came to luxury, and it was an honor to live or get a house in Liberty City.
A good-looking area by the 40s and into the 50s. We've seen home videos in color of the area, stuff we've read about it. It never had all the amenities of the white area. It didn't have parks. It did have a lot of problems with outdoor privies. Disease was rampant. But by the 50s, it was getting to be a good-looking community, even though it was still deprived from some things the white community had.
Earlier Overtown, when there were restaurants, businesses, beautician stores, barber shops, a Coca-Cola bottling plant there. They had their own funeral parlors and so forth, and real estate offices, etc., and nice homes.
On 2nd Avenue, Northwest 2nd Avenue in Overtown, then called Colored Town. There was a Mary Elizabeth Hotel. There was a Sir John Club. There was a Night Beat. There was the Zebra Lounge. And what happened was, and it's conventional wisdom, a lot of these black entertainers, and especially as you get into the post-World War II period, performed on the beach like the Sammy Davises, but they couldn't live there because of segregation. And so they would come to Overtown. Northwest 2nd Avenue just had a whole series of nightclubs, bars that attracted a lot of entertainment, and a lot of whites were coming over.
So you had people like Ella Fitzgerald, Nat King Cole. The list goes on and on. And the irony, the sort of reverse to the Jim Crow that existed in the period was that Overtown became a mecca for blacks and whites, etc. So that was one of the kinds of unintentional benefits.
It was a community then, had its own barbershops, its own this, its own that, like in Overtown, where we had businesses and things of that nature.
Years ago, Overtown was alive. 3 major hotels and a number of nightclubs catered to locals and drew people from all over the country to Black Miami's version of the sun and fun capital of the world. 2 newspapers kept Black Miamians in touch with themselves and the world. Black-owned businesses were sprinkled all over the community. From those businesses came the community leaders who, because of their strong commitment, made Overtown an important link in the civil rights struggle of that era.
Was among the early cities in the South to undertake civil rights activity. Educated African Americans either moved to the community or came back to the community, and it all kind of came together by the 1950s. You begin to see this. There was a march in 1963, which is well into the civil rights era, through a part of Overtown where you had a lot of whites and blacks in that march, and it was amazing how many folks were on that march. And by the early 60s, students, white students, black students, everybody's involved in the civil rights movement. Once the Civil Rights Act of 64 came, Voting Rights Act of 65, the handwriting was on the wall. I mean, you could resist, but you weren't going to resist very long because this is now the law. It wasn't just a Supreme Court ruling. And slowly things began to become dismantled.
The biggest link in the whole expressway plan is the North-South Expressway. On the map, it runs alongside of Northwest 6th Avenue. Well, this is the road we've been waiting for, one that will eventually take us all the way from the end of the Sunshine State Parkway down to and through the central business area of Miami.
Fast forward that to today's view, and you ask, what the heck happened? Certainly I would say it starts in the 50s with I-95 going straight through Overtown, and the building of that expressway, which was to bring whites in, make it easier for them to get to downtown, was destroyed. Overtown went straight through it, destroyed the businesses, the great hotels.
Urban renewal did. It knocked down almost everything. It looks like east of 2nd Avenue, which was the main street, and they were going to build new things there. That never happened. I-95, initially the talk was putting it over the FEC right-of-way, which would have spared Overtown. And instead they put it right through there, and as Jesse McCrary said in that interview on Eyes on the Prize, he said, we weren't at the board meetings, but it wouldn't matter. They weren't empowered. We couldn't have said anything at the board meetings. Nobody would have listened. We should have stuck to our knitting, he said. And been there. But the reality is in the 50s, there wasn't any black empowerment. They weren't registered to vote, they weren't on juries, they'd been discriminated against. I mean, segregation had worked. Jim Crow had worked. It had completely isolated this group of people.
And it's clear that the city fathers knew exactly what they were doing. There were all kinds of ways you could have brought this expressway into downtown without just destroying Overtown. But again, it was black folks, expendable, they had no political voice, straight through Overtown.
The crucifixion of Overtown, it seemed an apt metaphor for what happened there and what continues to happen, the fallout that we continue to see. When you look at the map, you see these interstates kind of running through eerily in the shape of a cross. And when doing this empirical work, conducting most of these interviews myself, talking to people, seeing what has happened to the neighborhood, it just seemed like a really apt metaphor. Folks continuing to suffer, the neighborhood having been sort of sacrificed such that other areas could be connected, other areas could benefit. Other areas could be redeemed, so to speak, to, stay within that metaphor. And Overtown having been sacrificed for that. The crucifixion seemed both visually and culturally, economically, sociopolitically kind of appropriate as a metaphor, unfortunately.
As the community grew, the white power brokers wanted to keep it constrained to the original borders. And if they traced beyond the original borders, meaning that they tried to, say, build across the street, sometimes they were pushed back by violence or by the police. The police really were sort of like the shock troops of the white establishment. Supportive of the white power structure, enforcing segregation and keeping blacks constrained to their borders. Again, the geography is a big thing here. Yeah, they were guardians of the order. There was a 1928 grand jury report that just really condemned the police, that they were just destroying the liberties of people. And that same grand jury returned an indictment against the police chief and a couple of his top henchmen in the murder of a black prisoner, Harry Keir. And the police chief and a couple of his top lieutenants were tried and acquitted in a 1928 trial. So it really condemned them for racial situations, but also just overall police harassment, corruption, and all. There were a lot of racial incidents early in Miami's history. The Ku Klux Klan marched through that community in the 1920s, late 1930s. They were still marching through there. There was some rioting on the part of whites living at the border between the white and black community, unhappy with the fact that blacks were trying to push out from there. You had a wall still standing as late as at least sometime in the 50s along Northwest 12th Avenue from 63rd Street north for about 10 blocks. Segregation wall separating. East of there was the white part, and then west was Liberty Square, the black housing project.
People who first moved out here were sort of confined to this area because of the wall, which is about 12 foot, you couldn't be on the other side without a pass or going to work or coming from work, or else you were in trouble, especially the kids. It wasn't demolished until sometime in the 60s that they tore that down.
When you had black folks living together, even though the outside world is sort of forcing that unity, Blacktown thrived. Blacktown was moving forward, etc., until the coming of I-95. And the irony is the new, quote-unquote, integration meant the destruction of those communities, because now black doctors, lawyers who would have lived in Overtown now can live in Coral Gables, Palmetto Bay, Pinecrest, etc., and you lose that base. And it's something that I don't see how you overcome it at all.
It was 3 days and 2 nights of destruction, the worst riot in Florida's history. 18 people killed, hundreds injured, property damage put at $80 million.
Here's Arthur McDuffie, this black insurance executive, and he's on a motorcycle ride, and he's running through lights, just speeding all over the place, and police give chase, and they finally stop him, and we don't know what exactly happened after that, except that he was bludgeoned to death by the police.
At 2 a.m. on December 17th, Arthur McDuffie, a 33-year-old insurance executive and former Marine, rode a borrowed motorcycle in the Brownsville section of Miami. A Dade County patrol car tried to pull him over for reckless driving. A high-speed chase began, ending here where Arthur McDuffie was fatally beaten by police.
Beat my child to death. They beat him to death like a dog.
The reaction of the black community was, this wasn't a death that was caused by policemen trying to defend themselves against an angry motorcyclist. This was a killing, and it was going to be almost whitewashed, that whole thing. But there was so much pressure from the black and other community elements, progressive white elements, that Jana Reno said, okay, we're going to investigate this further, and she came back with these indictments against those policemen. But it was really it was the unhappiness of black people about hearing about this, saying, here's another black man. It's been sacrificed.
It took 3 weeks to find a jury here. It took 4 weeks to hear all the arguments and the evidence, but it took the jury less than 3 hours to reach the verdict. On it went. Former Sergeant Ira Diggs, not guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter, not guilty of aggravated battery, tampering with evidence, and accessory after the fact. Alex Marrero, cleared of second-degree murder, acquitted of manslaughter, and not guilty of tampering with evidence.
4 of whom were later acquitted in a trial in May of 1980, and that triggered sometimes called the McDuffie Riot, the Miami Riot, Liberty City Riot, but the bludgeoning took place right at the edge of today's design district, Miami Avenue, just north of the 112 ramp that goes over that street. And that was the biggest race riot in American history up to that time.
The McDuffie riots and the riots that came on after that. I told a reporter then, I do not condone what was happening, but I certainly do understand it, because if I wasn't a preacher, chances are I would have been out there too.
I think just the overall despair The despair, I think, is two-pronged. It's the police, how heavy-handed they've been in the black community, and that's documented, and the fact that Overtown had been gutted. And this was, really the first black community in the city of Miami. Coconut Grove's black community doesn't become part of the city of Miami until 1925. And it had been gutted. And that was, that was the place where all these African Americans came to. And population in 1960 of Overtown was 34,000 plus. By 1990, it was less than 9,500. But just gutted. And so there was this despair, this kind of bleak landscape where there had been a community, despite the fact of segregation, had been a proud place. It was gone. And it just looked like things were getting worse and worse. And I believe that despair just helped this anger along.
Like many sort of urban, we used to refer to them as inner city, and now we say urban core, and we describe them in other ways now. Many such neighborhoods where we have a range of, there's a nexus there of failed systems coming together. So we have the educational system having failed residents. We have a lack of investment in decent, safe, and affordable housing. Jobs went elsewhere, and they've been areas that have been disinvested from.
The main obstacles that Overtown is facing is about 40 years of disinvestment in the economics and social and educational landscape of the community. And as a result, the residents have a lot of barriers to overcome in terms of improving the quality of life.
The Metro Miami Action Plan, or MAP, includes 176 recommendations in the areas of housing, education, and economic development. Since the MAP conference, more than $5 million have been generated to help implement the goals.
Originally, the Metro Miami Action Plan came about from the race riots that erupted in the beginning of 1980. And the idea behind the plan was to address some of the concerns and ease some of the racial tensions that were existing at that time in Miami-Dade County. Findings overall was that there were significant disparities between the conditions of the black community and white Anglos, and of course the Hispanics that were present at that time. And those disparities were across the board, in education, in economic advancement, in health. So there were a whole slew of issues that were found.
I would say that the African American community today is facing the greatest struggle in its history since the end of the institution of slavery. I'll point to one factor, and one factor alone. There are many factors I can point to, but if you look at the unemployment rate among African Americans, the most conservative count has the black unemployment rate is twice that of white America. Let me quote one of your sociologists, Sidney Wilhelm, a book he wrote many years ago titled, Who Needs the Negro? And I'll just use that title, Who Needs the Negro? And what South Florida has basically said to us is, who needs the Negro? Particularly with the influx of the Cuban population in the 1960s onward, certainly in the 1980s.
The Carter administration promised $3 million for a job training center. President Reagan's proposed budget cuts will sharply reduce that amount. Neither president has actually spent any money to set up the center. The Small Business Administration awarded $20 million for rebuilding, but according to one report, nearly 90% of the money went to whites or Hispanics, most of whom set up shop outside the riot area.
And you find blacks being let go, no longer of value in those jobs where they typically were the predominant part of the labor force, domestic service, you name it. They've been replaced all down the line, in the hotels, etc. The kinds of jobs that you would have thought, and indeed years past, African Americans, you would have seen a tremendous presence. They're rarely there at all. So there's been a major displacement. You look in the inner cities and the African American males, right, who can't find jobs, and there are no manufacturing positions there in the inner city. Where, in fact, are they going? They're going to go into the, sub-economy. They're going to sell dope, etc. They're going to be hanging around, nothing to do, and they become the fodder for the penal system.
Surplus labor need to be controlled, and the criminal justice system is wielded for that purpose. Instead of dealing with it in a more positive, either rehabilitative if it has to do with drug use, or constructive if it has to do with, say, skills training or some other way to manage home joblessness, we use the criminal justice system as a way to manage this surplus population of laborers.
You're talking about a people who are up against a system which, once it determines it no longer needs you, then it doesn't need you.
The more direct factors that have led to mass incarceration in the United States are the changes primarily in sentencing and punishment laws in the U.S., and particularly around drug offending. Before mass incarceration, we had roughly about 100 per 100,000. And so it was pretty flat from World War II all the way through the 70s. And it wasn't until Reagan in the 80s where the rhetoric became reality. We shifted from rehabilitating offenders and moved towards just warehousing offenders.
Person commits a crime, they're sentenced, they serve their time, but reality is that the minute that they walk out those doors, when those gates close behind them, that's when their real sentence begins.
You can't get a job when you come out. You got to eat some kind of way. They turn you out on the street, and if you don't have any way to support yourself, you're going to steal. A lot of times people, if you say you've been incarcerated, you're an ex-con, people want help you. You can't vote, your voting rights are taken away from you. And so what do you have? You're out there and with nothing.
Mass incarceration, you can see the effects are very visible in the Overtown neighborhood. Most striking probably is a large population of idle men, idle adult men.
Have a system like with mass incarceration that creates an environment to where when an individual is released, they're ostracized from their community. They can't vote, they can't live where they want to live, they can't get an education, they can't get a job. You create a scenario in which many of these individuals are forced to do what? Return back to a life of crime. And in the state of Florida, once you've been convicted of a felony, you automatically lose your civil rights for life. And what that means is that every day in the state of Florida, in minority communities, whenever a person gets arrested and convicted of a felony, that means that that minority community loses another political voice.
So we can see the manifestations of second-class status as people are barred from housing, access to health care, access to employment. And so I think that you certainly have people living at another level. They're walking around with a scarlet letter, so to speak. Something essential about personhood is being denied.
Factors for delinquency. The most powerful or significant risk factor is having an incarcerated parent.
It makes it hard for the family to survive when a family member has been incarcerated.
You know, what happens when we can't form the normal familial bonds and ties and social bonds? What happens to children, but also what happens to those parents and their capacity to find a role and a place in society and live what is a productive and rewarding life.
So you're basically, by having a concentrated area of where people are being incarcerated, you almost guarantee the next generation of delinquency.
And so mass incarceration plays a very important role in perpetuating or perpetrating crime within our community.
The numbers game is not on our side because America will be a minority-majority country in fairly short order. And if we keep writing off bulks of minority kids in these communities, we are setting up America for failure. So we need to take a practical and critical look at and rethink some of the policy choices that we have that we've implemented for the past 40 years because they're not working.